Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
Show 103, Give the People What They Want, brought to you live. Today, it's just Prashant from People's Dispatch, your favorite movement news site, peoplesdispatch.org. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter, coming to you as we do every week. This week without Zoe, unfortunately, but we're here, ready to go. Peace talks resumed in Venezuela between the various remnant factions in the Colombian civil war. Perhaps good things will come out of it. Lots of things to talk about today, but I think we're going to start with Prashant. Prashant, not only was there the ASEAN meeting, not only was there the G20 meeting in Bali, but there was that COP27 meeting. Seemed to have been anticipated. There was some drama, strum and drum during the meeting, and then boom, silence. What actually happened at the end in COP?
Right, Vijay. This is the third week we're talking about COP27. We talked a lot about COP26 as well. And, there's an unfortunate tone that often accompanies, I think, all of our coverage on this, which kind of encapsulates the situation. So COP27 ended overtime as usual. There was, it was a bit of a mixed outcome. On the one hand, the loss and damage fund that we talked about was finally agreed upon in principle, which is really the operative phrase here. It was agreed upon in principle. And there were a lot of outcomes which people were very disappointed about. We'll come first, of course, to the loss and damage point, because that's the aspect which has been celebrated a lot. So as we know, it's basically to help adaptation. That's help countries which are dealing with effects of climate change right now. Like, for instance, Pakistan, which is suffered billions worth of damage after those disastrous floods and then had to wait for funds. So the idea was that, if a disaster takes place, do you have to wait for months until you can scrounge together some kind of international funding for aid, or should there be a dedicated fund for this? Now, common sense would say that yes, there should be a dedicated fund for this because it's due to climate change. But what's been finally decided is that next year there'll be more clarity on this. So the key question is the operative aspects regarding who's going to pay, which is the single biggest question. There's a lot of disagreement on that. The richer countries, especially the West European countries, want what are classified as developing countries also to pay for this loss and damage fund, which is causing a lot of controversy. Then, of course, the other question is, what kind of form will this money come in? Will it come in the form of, say, loans? Will it come in the form of insurance schemes, for instance? Will it come in the form of private financing? All of which brings with it its own set of issues. And if you look at generally the kind of funding that has been taking place for climate change related issues, a lot of it has been in these forms. And activists and countries in the global south have very rightly called it out, saying that, this is kind of a cop-out in all kinds of ways. In fact, increasing the burden maybe on developing countries. So that's one aspect of the discussions that took place. The other, maybe one of the most crucial aspects is that the question of reducing global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels looks increasingly difficult, because say the emission of greenhouse gases continues to increase right now. We are not looking at, science says that ideally we should peak by 2025. It doesn't look anywhere close to happening at this point of time. Maybe 2030 is a more realistic estimate, maybe even later. So the possibility of that happening looks very, very slim at this point. And this already means that we are going to be seeing way more of an impact than you would, and then what we're seeing right now in terms of extreme weather events, in terms of destruction of sources of food, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of people having to migrate in huge numbers, in terms of submergence of coastal areas. It's really a recipe for disaster in so many ways. So that too, there's been no real concrete action on it. A lot of words, a lot of promises, but again, a depressing outcome. And I think another key aspect which we really need to highlight, probably one of the important point, is something which I think I want to quote the Bolivian official, the Bolivia's chief negotiator, who said that this principle of what is called common but differentiated responsibilities, which has been the bedrock of action on climate change since 1992, since the UN framework was devised is slowly vanishing. So according to him, he said that what seems to be happening is that it's becoming common but shared responsibility, where things are becoming so bad that the rich countries now can say that, hey, you know what, it's everyone's problem, let's all pitch in together, ignoring the historic inequality that led to climate change in the first place, ignoring the question that the rich countries have been responsible per capita for a huge amount of the emissions. And so they've taken things to such an extent that now it's easy for them to say, everyone should just stop emitting greenhouse gases. And this is an extremely dangerous precedent that we are seeing taking place here. It might get even heightened in the coming years as well. So all in all, not a very positive COP meeting. We know that fossil fuel representatives numbers were at a historic high this year, and next year is going to happen in the UAE. So you can possibly assume that might be the case there as well. So these are some of the important outcomes I think we need to highlight. Again, the fact that no real answer to the question of debt. How are countries going to deal with climate change when they're so indebted, and more billions in loans you have to take. So all these are issues which are not really seriously addressed. There's been namesake lip service, but that's about it.
Prashant, come on. We already mentioned that the problem of this loss and damage is hardly something novel, and I think it's interesting that the media, as it reports the aftermath of COP27, is suffering from acute amnesia and has forgotten that the loss and damage question was agreed upon at COP25 in Santiago, where there was the Santiago loss and damage agreement, which has basically been recycled in COP27 as a victory. It's extraordinary, isn't it? Absolute case of media amnesia in reporting on this COP, and believing in a way the headline that the leaders of COP at Egypt wanted to promote, that, oh, well, look, we had a breakthrough on loss and damage. Excuse me, you had a breakthrough in 2019. You're just repeating the same press release. Anyway, talk about repeating. How many times on this show have we come back to the question of Mali and France? Over and over again. Very interesting story. November 21st, interim Prime Minister of Mali, Colonel Abdoulaye Maïga, releases a statement on social media saying, hey, listen, French NGOs no longer welcome in Mali. Now, in a sense, Colonel Maïga's statement didn't come from nowhere. He didn't initiate this. From February onwards, after the junta led by a military section that had taken power in Mali last year in a second coup, really an anti-French coup. From February onwards, the French government said, look, we are no longer going to provide Mali with ODA. That's the Overseas Development Assistance. France was quite categorical. You're out. Why, France? Why did you cut ODA in February? Interesting. The French didn't talk about the military coup. They didn't talk about corruption in Mali, the normal things one hears about. France directly said, we're angry because the Malian military is associating with Russia's Wagner group. Principal reason, they said, was the Wagner group. So Colonel Maïga, when he retaliated, as it were, on November 21st, said in his social media post, not only, look, no more French NGOs operating in Mali, but he said, we are retaliating because of your absurd allegations. Interesting. There are two narratives at work here. Number one, there is increasing anti-French sentiment, such that in actually 2019, before this, spate of coups in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea, before that, the French basically had to come to terms with the fact that no longer could France hold 50% of the reserves of the West African countries, holding them because these countries operate with a currency called the CFA franc, which is actually controlled by monetary unions in West Africa and in the Sahel. To be fair to the French, they don't really control it, although about almost half of the personnel in these monetary unions was seconded from the Treasury Department in Paris. And as I said, 50% of the assets had to be held in French banks. 2019, France said it will divest from this. Just as a back note, people may have forgotten, in 2011, there was Nicolas Sarkozy's war against Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi had been on a tear for at least 2 or 3 years, arguing for the substitution of the CFA franc by something they wanted to call the Afrique, a new African currency. Didn't happen. Gaddafi was overthrown. That was the end of that. Well, interestingly, one narrative is that there's this anti-French sentiment, very plausible, because there's a lot of anger at France from Algeria onwards, saying you've been colluding with the Islamists who hold about maybe almost 50% of the landmass in Mali. Mali is a very large country. The second narrative is France's storyline, saying that no, the real question is that the Malian military is working with the Wagner group. Now, it's true. The current defense minister in Mali, the chief of the air staff, they were both in Moscow twice last year. They were in Moscow again this year. Indeed, there are Russian mercenaries in Mali, about 800 of them. Very insignificant number in terms of the number of French troops were there in Barkhane, which was in the tens of thousands. But at any rate, there are some Russian troops. The dispute is whether this particular confluence, this particular clash between France and Mali is about Russia's involvement in the Sahel region, or it's really about anti-French sentiment. Smells a lot like part of the anti-French wave, but what do I know? You want to hear more about this? Don't read the press either in Paris or in New York. You might have to actually listen to the Malians a little bit. But again, what do we know? I mean, we just run a weekly show where we focus on Mali a lot and try to get you the news about it. A lot of anti-Russian propaganda in Africa. Some of it is sticking, but not all of it. Not all of it. And I think that's the bottom line in this. Speaking about tough stories, Prashant, back to Palestine. Over 50 children killed by the Israelis this year. What's the story with Palestine?
Right, Vijay, of course, we're talking a few days ahead of what is called the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. This is the 29th of November that's marked every year, of course. And this is the 45th year on which, it's supposed to be marked. The first such day was marked in 1977, I believe. Or, that is when the resolution was passed. So this is the 45th anniversary of that. Curious time frame, this 45 years, 1977, when it was passed. It was 10 years after the 1967 war, which altered the ground reality considerably in Palestine. Israel's occupation, rose to new heights in the period following that war. And it's something that was, of course, never reversed. But in the 45 years since, looking back in 2022, when you look back, it's horrifying to the extent to which the ground situation has changed if you look at what's been happening. And this year, I think, exemplifies those trends, because on the one hand, like you said, you have the kind of atrocities that are taking place purely in terms of brutal killings. Alone this year has been the worst year since 2005 in the occupied West Bank, when the UN started collecting numbers. And I believe the total number of 203 people, Palestinians, have been killed in all the occupied territories together. And of course, we see other forms of brutality as well. Just yesterday, the news came that 20-year-old Ahmed Mansara, who has been in jail for over 7 years, a judge has extended his solitary confinement by another 4 months, saying that he is a threat to himself. And this is after lawyers have said that his mental health has been significantly deteriorating. And Israel's answer is that the Israeli establishment's answer is that, that means he's a threat to himself and others, so he should be kept in solitary confinement. It really, there's no way of even comprehending this kind of logic. But of course, there are killings, there are such instances, but also this year also marks yet another rightward lurch as far as Israel is concerned. And there's no greater example of that than the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu and Itamar bin Gvir, his new ally, who earlier even Netanyahu was reluctant to ally with him. That is how right-wing he was. But now everything seems possible in Israeli politics. They agreed to sort of retroactively legalize the illegal outposts, which even Israel used to call illegal until recently. So we know that through the system of settlements and outposts, They have basically encroached massively on Palestinian land. They have basically broken Palestinian land into small bits, which makes continuous travel impossible. There's this whole network of checkpoints of the apartheid wall, for instance, and these settlements and outposts are in many ways the tip of their spear, whereby they basically destroy the possibility of a Palestinian state. And while Israel has legally, has encouraged both these settlements and outposts in which over 700,000 people live, settlers live, it somehow maintained this fiction that while they considered the settlements legal, the outposts were not legal according to them. And this is what they've retroactively decided to legalize as part of this new government formation that is taking place. So that itself, I think, again goes to show that from 1977, when we look back, it's when we look back and when you look at the situation today, it shows how immeasurably the situation has changed. So this is a part of the issue. Of course, the other larger part of the issue, the other aspects being, we talked about Sheikh Jarrah in the past, we talked about the attacks, we talked about the rhetoric. So all in all, I think a very difficult time for the Palestinians. Their resistance, of course, continuing. The resistance continuing very bravely and valiantly. But I think it's up for the international community to sort of ask itself this question as they mark this day. The UN has an event, for instance. You might find regular statements from the European Union and others promising to uphold Palestinian sovereignty and rights. But I think the real question is something else: that what has the international community done after making all these claims and making all these commitments in various resolutions?
Prashant, it's a distressing story and has been so for a very long time, and it's important that we keep on it. You're listening to Give the People What They Want, coming to you from People's Dispatch. That's Prashant. He's the editor of People's Dispatch, along with Zoe. We don't have Zoe with us today. She'll be back next week. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Happy to be with you. I'm here sitting in the Independent Republic of Dongshengistan with my colleagues Tings and Marco from Dongsheng and Manolo. Keeping me company. Happy to be with you. Want to talk a little bit about that war in Ukraine, Prashant, which has been going on and on and on. Stunning news recently. We, of course, have already talked about the fact that there was a missile that came from Ukrainian territory, likely shot by the Ukrainians, landed in Poland. Well, one would have thought that after the mishap with the Associated News, where the Associated Press came out and said, well, it was a Russian missile. In fact, the Associated Press let go the reporter who wrote that story. After all that, it looks like increasingly NATO is going to be putting Patriot batteries both in Poland and other states that border Ukraine. Very dangerous. In fact, the Polish premier and defense minister said that the Patriot batteries coming from Germany are going to be actually flush on the border between Poland and Ukraine, which means if there is any error, they can now once again be the accusation that there was an attack on a NATO country. Pretty striking and scary stuff over there, including, of course, now we know $400 million more coming from the US in often lethal military equipment. That amounts to close to $20 billion coming from the United States into Ukraine. I mean, there's also other things. The United Kingdom, for the first time, is sending Seeking helicopters to Ukraine. These are manned helicopters, lethal helicopters coming in. Now, nobody is saying that the Russian assault hasn't been quite brutal and hitting areas where civilians are and so on. But I must say the ramping up both of these financial support to buy military equipment from the West on the one side, and secondly, the provision of these Patriot batteries into frontline states around Ukraine, very chilling and disturbing, I think, storylines, which, of course, we've been following, trying to make sense of. I have to say, I've reported a number of conflicts, wars, and so on. Very difficult to actually get a handle of what's going on. People are too quick to rush in and make claims about what happens in battlefields. Very ugly situation. As reporters, of course, most of us pretty sensitive people, we'd like to see some kind of, resolution, a ceasefire, taking stock of the damage and so on. looks unlikely, Prashant, not with more money coming in from the United States into Ukraine to, in a sense, prolong the war. Looks unlikely from Moscow, where this has really become a prestige issue. Ugly war, all wars in a sense ugly. This one ugly for being prolonged beyond, I think, the time that it needed to have gone on for. Point is made, I think, on all sides. But let's see. We'll be watching carefully, as we have been watching carefully, trying as best as possible to make sense of what's going on. Well, speaking of belligerence, war, and things like that, United States has, of course, made a habit of coming and poking its stick in the areas around China. You had Nancy Pelosi bringing two congressional delegations into Taipei, making all kinds of comments about what should Taiwan do and shouldn't do. Of course, the Taiwanese not so much a protagonist in this as U.S. Congress people. Well, now it looks like the United States has sent another honorable guest into the Philippines. Who's that, Prashant?
Right. This is, of course, Vice President Kamala Harris, who visited the Philippines and was received two very contrasting welcomes. On the one hand, of course, you had the Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos government going all out to receive her, red carpet welcome, and then you had activists in the ground raising a slogan which is interesting. Among many, many slogans, of course, one of which was just said Harris imperialist, which I think conveyed pretty much what this entire segment is about. So, like I said, civil society organizations not very happy with the visit for multiple reasons. And I think there are two aspects to look at here. Of course, on the one hand, we do know that the Bongbong Marcos government has a very problematic record in various ways. We talked about it on this show before, inheriting a legacy which is also is not a great legacy. Let's say, both in terms of the previous Rodrigo Duterte government that it succeeded, and the legacy of the older Marcos Sr., who was a very close ally of the US, also one of the most brutal dictators in the region. So activists on the one hand were a bit unhappy about that aspect, the fact that Kamala Harris was coming there in some senses sanctifying that regime, so to speak, but also the fact that although it may not be that well known, the United States also has a very say close military alliance or assistance program with the United States, with the Philippines for a number of years. In fact, I think between 2015 and 2022, it received arms equipment and training to the tune of about 1.14 billion, and that itself kind of shows the how much it's investing in the Philippines. And why it's doing so, it's pretty simple, because as far as the United States is concerned, causing tension in Southeast Asia, in the Asia Pacific region, is of vital strategic relevance to the US, and that's how this connects to what Nancy Pelosi was doing in Taiwan as well, because as part of its encircling China strategy, what the US would like to do is to sort of keep those conflicts going on in Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific region. Now, I think it's you sort of take it for granted that any region, countries are going to have differences over borders, over trade, over commerce, over a number of issues, history. There's there's no region in the world where everything is hunky dory. So it's undoubtedly there's no doubts about the fact that there will be conflicts and disagreements. I think what's significant is that countries, despite having them, continue to move forward. For instance, we had a couple of years ago the RCEP deal being signed in that region, the biggest trading bloc in the world, and this was signed by countries, all of whom have differences. And I think that's pretty much how diplomacy works. That's how relations between countries work. That you have differences, but nonetheless you also engage with each other. And this is something which the United States really finds does not suit its own agenda. And so it's in this context that you need to see Kamala Harris's visit, and also the visit to what is called the Palawan province, which is very close to what is known as the Spratly Islands, where there is a bit of tension over issues of sovereignty. There are multiple claims being made in the region. So the fact that she actually chose to be there, make statements from there, actually made a lot of activists very jittery. The fact that why is the United States coming and raising this bogey once again at a time, when already things are not, the tensions are high in the region because, for instance, of the issue of Taiwan and intervention over there. So all these things considered, yet another visit by a US official, which is not meant to promote cooperation or promote goodwill, but to subtly and not so subtly promote these kind of tensions. And it often makes you think you only see this happening, US officials landing in difficult parts of the world and making those statements. And to the reverse never happens. Just as you only have US warships in the South China Sea or in the or the Pacific Ocean where they have no business to be. So it actually kind of shows the skews in the order, which often we don't notice because we take it so much for granted. All right, US ships, they go all over the world, but nobody ever thinks that, hey, why is it only that US ships are there in places where they have no business to be?
It's the habits of finger wagging. The habits of finger wagging are unique to the United States. Incredible. It's a tough week. I lost a very close friend of mine of 30 years to diabetes. He's been struggling with the disease for a long time. The 14th of November was World Diabetes Day. This is the 100th anniversary of the discovery of insulin, a key medicine to treat diabetes, one of the great untreated ailments in the global south. My friend was only 54 years old, died of diabetes. The reason I'm saying this is I'm entering into telling you about a story to do with measles. You see, a lot of focus over the last 3 years around the COVID pandemic. There was a lockdown, then there were the creation at rapid speed of vaccines, vaccination programs, and so on. During this entire period, there was a great neglect of other healthcare challenges, including vaccination programs and the delivery of insulin to people in various countries simply had very much lowered supplies as a consequence of a great shift to tackling COVID as a primary, as the primary ailment of our times. Well, the WHO, the World Health Organization, has been warning over the last few months over the decline in vaccination programs for other things other than COVID. Now, it must be said, COVID vaccines are still not available in many parts of the world. We know that in some countries, 70% vaccination won't happen until the year 2100. We already know that. I mean, it's already scandalous. Any rate, let's come to the pressing issue that the World Health Organization has just reported on, and that's measles. Measles is a big killer of children. I think people don't appreciate the fact that in many parts of the global south, ailments like measles and mumps continue to take the lives of young people who are not vaccinated. WHO says that something like 90% of children need to get the first dose of a measles vaccine to allow for what is known as herd immunity. I know there's a lot of controversy around the idea of herd immunity, but nonetheless, that's what the WHO says. They say the threshold is about 90%. As a consequence of the lack of vaccinations, as you know, because of the COVID pandemic, in 2021, last year, the vaccination rate for the first dose of the measles vaccine was at 81%. The second dose was down to 71%. Now, what the WHO worries about is that 40 million children will not have received the vaccine. This is the lowest first dose percentage since 2008. This is going to be, at least the WHO believes, pretty catastrophic. Lots of countries are going to experience a pretty invisible, death rate for children who will die of measles. I say invisible because this gets reported very, very little. I want to urge you to go to the People's Dispatch website and follow the coverage People's Dispatch does through People's Health Dispatch, which is produced in collaboration with the People's Health Movement. Very much like to have you go and look at the People's Health Movement work on some of these issues. Now, Prashant, I don't know if the People's Health Dispatch is going to cover the measles story. I hope it does. It's an important story. These are the neglected stories about children in the poorest parts of the world. And I must say, whatever criticisms one has of the United Nations, and there are many that one could have, whatever criticisms you have about the World Health Organization, they simply don't forget to keep telling us that these are real issues that impact poor children in vulnerable parts of our great planet. Please go and read People's Dispatch stories on many of these issues. You've been listening to Give the People What They Want, brought to you by People's Dispatch. Today it was Prashant. Zoe's on leave. She'll be back next week. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. See you next week. It'll be show 104. Looking forward to your selfies.